The mysterious swamp. The air was thick and heavy, clinging to Jake like a damp blanket. Every step he took squelched in the soggy ground of the alien swamp. His boots, already covered in mud, made it difficult to walk. The smell was worse, a mix of rotting vegetation and something metallic. But Jake had a job to do. He was sent by Earth's mining company to collect rare mineral samples from this uncharted planet, and quitting wasn't an option. Jake adjusted the strap of his scanning device, its screen flickering as it picked up faint energy signatures nearby. He squinted through the mist, which hung like a curtain over the swamp. Visibility was terrible, and the sounds of croaking creatures echoed all around. Somewhere in the distance, water dripped steadily, adding to the eerie atmosphere. Just another day on the job, Jake muttered to himself, trying to shake off the unease creeping up his spine. The company had warned him about the planet's harsh environment, but no one mentioned how alive the swamp would feel, almost as if it was watching him. The scanner beeped, louder this time. Jake froze, staring at the screen. The device was picking up a life form, humanoid but different. It was stationary, about 50 meters ahead. He glanced around but saw nothing except the endless swamp. "Must be a glitch," he said, shaking the device. But the beeping continued, insistent. His heart thumped faster. If there really was someone out here, it couldn't be human. Earth's survey teams had claimed this planet was uninhabited. Cautiously, Jake moved toward the signal. The fog thickened, wrapping around him like tendrils. The sound of his footsteps seemed unnaturally loud now, and every rustle in the bushes made him pause. The beeping grew louder, the signal stronger. Whatever it was, he was getting closer. Then he heard it, a voice, sharp and clear, cutting through the swamp's silence. "Come on, human, drench me already." Jake stopped in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. The voice was feminine, commanding, but laced with desperation. He scanned the area, his eyes darting between the trees and the murky pools of water. There was no one in sight. "Who's there?" Jake called out, his voice echoing. He gripped the handle of his utility knife, though he doubted it would be much help against an alien threat. "Over here." The voice shouted again, more impatient this time. Jake turned toward the sound and saw her. She was stuck waist-deep in a mud pit, her upper body covered in a slick layer of muck. Despite the dirt, there was no mistaking her alien features. Her skin glowed faintly, a soft bluish hue that seemed to pulse with her heartbeat. Her large, luminous eyes locked onto Jake, filled with a mix of anger and urgency. Her hair, if it could be called that, was like fine, silver threads clinging to her face. "What are you waiting for?" she snapped. "Drench me." Jake stared, unsure if he was hallucinating. What?" She rolled her glowing eyes. "The mud is alive, idiot. It's draining my energy. Use water. Anything liquid. Hurry, before it's too late." Jake's instincts screamed at him to turn and run. This could be a trap. For all he knew, she was some kind of swamp predator luring him in. But the fear in her voice felt real. Her arms trembled as she struggled to pull herself free, but the mud held her like a vice. Against his better judgment, Jake pulled out his water pack. It wasn't much, just enough for emergencies. But it was all he had. He approached cautiously, the mud gurgling ominously around her. "Don't get too close," she warned. "Pour the water from a distance, or you'll get stuck too." Jake nodded, stepping back slightly before opening the pack. He poured the water over the mud around her waist, watching as it hissed and bubbled. The alien girl let out a relieved gasp as the mud loosened its grip. She pulled herself free, collapsing onto the drier ground nearby. Jake stepped back, keeping a safe distance. What are you?" he asked, his voice shaky. The girl sat up, wiping the muck from her face. Her glow brightened slightly, a sign that she was regaining strength. She looked at him, her expression a mix of exhaustion and gratitude. "I'm Leora," she said, brushing the silver threads of her hair away from her eyes. "And you, human, just saved my life." Jake didn't know what to say. His mind raced with questions, but one thing was clear: this was no ordinary mission. Whatever was happening in this swamp, he was now a part of it. The ground beneath him shifted slightly, almost as if the swamp was reacting to their presence. Jake glanced down, then back at Leora. "What's going on here?" he asked. Leora's expression darkened. "You shouldn't be here, human. This swamp, it's alive, and it doesn't take kindly to intruders." For the first time, Jake realized he might be in way over his head. The mud-covered girl. Jake's heart raced as the swamp seemed to come alive around him. The air buzzed with an unnatural energy, and the faint glow of the mud pit pulsed like a heartbeat. His instincts screamed to leave, but he couldn't. Not after seeing her. "Why are you staring like an idiot? Do something." The alien girl barked, her voice cutting through the eerie silence. Jake hesitated, unsure whether to trust her. She looked humanoid, but far too strange to be from Earth. Her glowing blue skin shimmered even under the layer of muck, and her silver hair sparkled faintly, reflecting the swamp's dim light. Her luminous eyes, wide with fear, locked onto his. She didn't seem like a monster, but out here, looks could deceive. "What's wrong with the mud?" Jake finally asked, his voice shaky but steady enough. "It's not mud," she snapped, struggling against its grip. "It's a predator, a living trap. It feeds on energy, and I'm its meal. If you don't pour water on it, it'll finish me off and come for you next." Jake's eyes darted to the writhing, gurgling surface of the pit. It wasn't just mud. It was moving, almost breathing, as though alive. Tendrils of sludge crept toward Leora's legs, clinging to her skin like leeches. "How do I know this isn't a trap?" Jake asked, taking a cautious step back. The girl groaned in frustration, her head falling back against the mud. "If I wanted to kill you, I wouldn't be stuck here begging for water. Just help me, or get lost, and let this thing eat you next." Jake clenched his jaw, wrestling with his fear. There wasn't time to argue. Whatever she was right about one thing. This swamp wasn't natural. He grabbed his emergency water pack, unscrewing the nozzle with shaking hands. "Stay still," he muttered, more to himself than her. Stepping closer, he angled the pack and poured a steady stream of water onto the mud. The reaction was instant. The mud hissed and bubbled, retreating as if burned. Leora gasped, her body jerking as she pulled herself free. Jake stepped back, watching as the last tendrils of sludge melted away, leaving her sprawled on the damp ground, breathing heavily. Finally, she muttered, sitting up and brushing the muck from her arms. She glared at Jake with a mix of exhaustion and annoyance. "Took you long enough." Jake lowered the empty water pack, still trying to process what had just happened. "You're welcome," he said dryly, his voice tinged with sarcasm. Leora snorted, a strange, almost musical sound. "Don't expect a thank you card. You might have saved me, but you're the reason this swamp is waking up." Jake's stomach dropped. "What are you talking about?" She stood shakily, her glowing skin now a brighter, healthier hue. "You humans, you come to planets like this, digging and mining, and you think nothing will fight back. The swamp, it's alive. It doesn't want you here. I'm just here to collect samples," Jake protested, raising his hands defensively. "I didn't come to start a war with mud." "Samples?" Leora laughed bitterly. "Every piece of this place is connected, human. You take one thing, and the swamp knows. It remembers." Jake stared at her, unsure if she was crazy or if he was. "You're saying the swamp is what? Sentient?" "Not just sentient," Leora said, her tone serious now. "It's ancient. It's a guardian. And thanks to you, it's angry." Before Jake could respond, the ground beneath them trembled. The mud pit that had trapped Leora began to expand, the edges bubbling and rippling outward. Jake stumbled back as more tendrils rose from the muck, twisting in the air like searching fingers. Lyora grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. Run. Jake didn't need to be told twice. He bolted, following her as she led the way through the swamp. The sounds of gurgling and hissing grew louder behind them, the living mud surging after them like a relentless wave. "Where are we going?" Jake shouted, dodging low-hanging vines and leaping over roots. "Somewhere safe," Lyora yelled back. "If there's anywhere left on this cursed planet." Jake's lungs burned as they ran, but questions burned hotter in his mind. Who was this alien girl? What exactly was happening in this swamp? And most importantly, how had he become part of it? For now, there were no answers, only the swamp's fury closing in behind them. A race against time, the swamp growled. Not literally, but that's how Jake would describe it. The deep, rumbling vibrations underfoot sent waves of unease through his body. He could feel the swamp moving, alive, restless, and angry. He followed Lyora as she sprinted ahead, her glowing form cutting through the fog like a beacon. "Faster, human," she shouted over her shoulder. "I'm trying." Jake snapped back, his boots slipping on the damp ground. He had no idea where she was leading him, but it didn't matter. Staying in one place wasn't an option. Behind them, the living mud surged like a tide, swallowing everything in its path. Trees sank into the bubbling muck, their twisted branches disappearing with a gurgle. Lyora stopped suddenly, her arms shooting out to block Jake's path. He nearly crashed into her. "What now?" he panted, doubling over to catch his breath. She pointed to a clearing ahead. "That's the edge of the swamp's territory. If we can make it there, we'll be safe." Jake squinted through the fog. The ground ahead looked drier, less hostile, but it was still at least 100 yards away. Between them and safety was a maze of roots, pools of stagnant water, and the ever-encroaching sludge. "You're sure about this?" Jake asked, eyeing the clearing. Lyora's glow dimmed slightly, her exhaustion showing. "No, but it's our best shot." Jake wasn't thrilled with her answer, but he didn't have time to argue. The mud was closing in, forming long tendrils that lashed out like whips. One of them struck a tree nearby, and the entire trunk dissolved into sludge within seconds. "That's not normal," Jake muttered. "Nothing here is normal." Lyora snapped. "Now move." They bolted toward the clearing, dodging the mud's relentless attacks. Jake's legs burned, but adrenaline pushed him forward. Behind him, the swamp let out another deep rumble, and the ground shook violently. He glanced back to see a massive wave of mud rising, towering above the trees like a tidal wave. "Oh, come on," Jake shouted, his voice rising in panic. "Don't look back." Lyora yelled, grabbing his arm and pulling him forward. "It feeds on fear. Just keep running." The words barely registered. Jake was too focused on the ground in front of him, navigating the treacherous terrain as quickly as he could. Lyora moved with surprising speed and grace, leaping over roots and skimming across the mud without sinking. Jake envied her agility, but had no time to admire it. As they neared the clearing, a tendril of sludge shot out, wrapping around Jake's ankle. He stumbled, hitting the ground hard. The mud tightened its grip, pulling him back toward the wave. "Lyora," he shouted, clawing at the ground. She skidded to a stop, her glowing eyes narrowing. "Hold on," she called, sprinting back toward him. Jake gritted his teeth, fighting against the pull. The mud was cold and slimy, and it felt alive, writhing against his skin. He could feel its hunger, like a predator savoring its catch. Lyora reached him, her hands glowing brighter as she knelt by his leg. "This is going to sting," she warned. Before Jake could respond, she placed her glowing hands on the tendril. A sizzling sound filled the air, and the mud recoiled, releasing its grip. Jake scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding. "Thanks," he gasped, still shaken. "Don't thank me yet," Lyora said grimly. It's not done with us. The wave of mud roared, surging closer. They were only a few steps from the clearing, but it felt impossibly far. Run, Leora shouted again, and Jake didn't need to be told twice. With one final burst of energy, they crossed into the clearing. The instant their feet touched the drier ground, the mud stopped. The wave collapsed, retreating back into the swamp with a defeated gurgle. The tendrils dissolved, and the eerie rumbling faded into silence. Jake collapsed onto the ground, his chest heaving. Leora stood nearby, her glow dim but steady. She watched the swamp whirly, as if expecting it to strike again. What was that? Jake managed to say between breaths. The swamp, Leora replied, her voice quieter now. It's alive, and it's protecting itself. You humans disturbed it, and now it sees everything as a threat. Jake looked at her, still trying to process what had just happened. You keep saying you humans. What exactly did we do? Leora turned to him, her glowing eyes filled with anger and sadness. You dug too deep. You woke it up. Jake's stomach sank. He thought he was just here for minerals, but it was clear now that his mission had unleashed something far more dangerous, and he wasn't sure if he could fix it. A fragile alliance. The swamp's eerie silence was unnerving. Jake stood at the edge of the clearing, his hands on his knees, trying to catch his breath. His heart still pounded from the chase, but now it wasn't fear keeping him on edge. It was Leora. She paced back and forth, her glowing skin flickering like a dying flame. There was something about her, an intensity that made Jake unsure whether she was an ally or just another danger waiting to strike. We can't stay here, she said sharply, breaking the silence. The swamp is retreating, but it's not done with us. It's just regrouping. Jake straightened, wiping sweat and mud from his face. And where exactly do you suggest we go? Back into the swamp? Because that seems like a death wish. Leora stopped pacing and turned to him, her eyes narrowing. Do you think I dragged you out of there just to argue? I saved your life. Human. Try to keep up. Jake folded his arms, his exhaustion giving way to irritation. You're welcome, by the way, for the whole Drench me rescue thing. She snorted, a sound that might have been a laugh if it weren't so condescending. That wasn't a rescue. It was the bare minimum. And if you hadn't been here, I wouldn't have been stuck in the first place. Jake blinked. How is that my fault? Leora stepped closer, jabbing a glowing finger toward his chest. Because you're kind, you're mining, you're drilling, woke up the swamp. It's not just mud. It's alive, and it remembers. You disturbed it, and now it's hunting everything in its path. Jake took a step back, her words hitting harder than he cared to admit. He wasn't some corporate bigwig. He was just an explorer, a guy trying to do his job. But the way Leora looked at him, it was like she saw him as the face of every wrong humanity had ever done. I didn't wake anything up, Jake said defensively. I was sent here to collect samples, not start a war with a sentient swamp. Leora shook her head, her silver hair catching the faint light of her glow. You're part of it, whether you like it or not. And now so am I. Jake frowned, sensing something deeper in her tone. What do you mean? Why were you out there in the first place? She hesitated, her glow dimming slightly. I was studying the swamp. My people, we've been trying to understand it for decades. We thought we could unlock its secrets, use its energy for good. But then your kind showed up, and everything changed. Jake tilted his head, curiosity overcoming his frustration. Changed how? Leora's expression hardened. The swamp isn't just alive. It's a memory, the living archive of this planet's history. It reacts to change, to damage. Your mining operations, they'd disturbed something buried deep, something that was meant to stay hidden. Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the swamp's damp air. What kind of something are we talking about? Leora didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned away, staring back toward the swamp. Something old, something powerful. And now it's awake. Jake ran a hand through his hair, trying to process what she was saying. So what do we do? If this thing is as dangerous as you say, shouldn't we warn my people? Shut down the mining. Leora turned back to him, her eyes blazing. It's too late for warnings. The swamp sees all of you as threats now. If you go back, it'll consume everything. Great, Jake muttered, rubbing his temples. So we're stuck out here, waiting for a mud monster to kill us. Fantastic plan. Leora's expression softened, just slightly. There is a way. But it's risky. Jake raised an eyebrow. Define risky. Leora stepped closer, lowering her voice. The swamp can be calmed, but only if we reach its core, the heart. It's where all the energy, the memories, are concentrated. If we can communicate with it, maybe we can convince it to stop. Jake stared at her, incredulous. You want me to have a heart-to-heart with a swamp? It's not just a swamp. Leora snapped. It's complicated, and it doesn't speak your language. That's where I come in. Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. Of course it doesn't. So, what's the catch? The heart is deep in the swamp, Leora said. Getting there means going through its most dangerous parts, and if it doesn't like what we have to say. She didn't finish the sentence, but Jake didn't need her to. He rubbed the back of his neck, debating his options. None of them were good, but sitting around waiting to die wasn't exactly appealing either. Fine, he said finally. We'll go to this heart, but if I die out there, I'm haunting you. Leora smirked, her glow brightening slightly. Deal. And with that, their fragile alliance was sealed. Two unlikely allies, heading into the heart of a living swamp that wanted them both dead. What could possibly go wrong? The hidden truth. The air grew heavier as Jake and Leora ventured deeper into the swamp. It wasn't just the humidity. It was the feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes following their every move. The swamp seemed to pulse with life, the ground beneath their feet shifting subtly as if breathing. Jake kept his voice low as they walked. You've been oddly quiet for someone who likes to argue. What's on your mind? Leora glanced at him, her silver hair glinting faintly in the dim light. Thinking about how many ways this could go wrong. Well, that's comforting, Jake muttered, stepping over a tangle of roots. You said this swamp is alive. If it's so dangerous, why didn't your people leave it alone? Leora sighed, the glow of her skin dimming slightly as she walked. Because knowledge is power. The swamp isn't just alive. It's a memory, the living archive of everything that's ever happened on this planet. My people wanted to understand it, to learn from it. Jake frowned, glancing at the shifting mud around them. And how did that go? Not well, Leora admitted. We underestimated it. The swamp isn't just a memory. It's a guardian. It's protecting something, and we don't know what. All we know is that your people's mining woke it up, and now it sees everything as a threat. Jake stopped, his brow furrowing. Wait, what do you mean, protecting something? What could a swamp possibly be guarding? Leora hesitated, her gaze darting toward the dark horizon. That's what I was trying to find out before you showed up and made everything worse. Jake rolled his eyes. You're welcome, by the way, for saving your life. Leora ignored his sarcasm, her tone growing more serious. This swamp is ancient. It's seen civilizations rise and fall. Whatever it's protecting, it's powerful enough that the swamp is willing to destroy anything that gets too close. Jake's stomach churned. So, let me get this straight. We're walking into the heart of a sentient swamp that hates us, to confront whatever it's guarding. Something so dangerous, it's worth killing over. Exactly, Leora said, her glowing eyes narrowing. Still want to turn back? Jake considered it for a moment but shook his head. Turning back isn't an option. My people need to know what's going on here. If we can stop this thing, we have to try. Leora studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded. Good, Because we're almost there. Jake followed her gaze and froze. Ahead of them, the swamp seemed to shift into another form entirely. The ground became smoother, almost glass-like, and glowed faintly with a pulsing blue light. Massive roots twisted upward like the ribs of some ancient beast, forming a natural archway that led into the unknown. "The heart," Leora said softly. "It's through there." Jake swallowed hard, his hands tightening into fists. "What happens if it doesn't listen to us?" Leora glanced at him, her glow brightening. "Then we don't leave." Jake exhaled slowly, his breath shaky. "Great. No pressure." Together, they stepped under the archway, entering the heart of the swamp. The air grew warmer, heavier, as if the swamp itself was pressing down on them. The glowing ground pulsed faster now, the rhythm matching Jake's racing heart. In the center of the chamber was a massive glowing pool of liquid. It shimmered with an otherworldly light, casting strange, shifting shadows on the walls. Tendrils of energy coursed across its surface, crackling softly like distant thunder. "This is it," Leora whispered, her voice reverent. "The heart." Jake stared at the pool, feeling a strange mix of awe and dread. "So, what do we do?" "We speak to it," Leora said, stepping closer to the edge of the pool. "But it doesn't understand words. It reads emotions, intentions. If it senses fear, anger, or greed, it will reject us." Jake raised an eyebrow. "And by reject, you mean?" Leora's silence was answer enough. Jake took a deep breath, stepping up beside her. "All right, let's do this." The heart pulsed, its light growing brighter as if aware of their presence. The swamp seemed to hum around them, the sound vibrating through Jake's bones. He could feel it, an ancient, overwhelming intelligence watching, waiting. Leora closed her eyes, her glow intensifying, as she reached out her hands. The energy in the air thickened, and Jake felt his mind brush against something vast and unfathomable. Images and emotions flooded his senses, memories not his own, visions of a world untouched by humans. The heart was speaking, and it was angry. The final confrontation. A heart's fury was palpable. Jake stood frozen at the edge of the glowing pool, every instinct screaming at him to run. Tendrils of light snaked out from the shimmering liquid, crackling with energy that felt alive. The swamp hummed around them, a deep, resonating sound that thrummed in his chest like a second heartbeat. It wasn't just alive, it was aware, and it was furious. "Leora," Jake shouted over the growing hum. "What's it doing?" Leora stood a few steps ahead, her silver hair shimmering in the eerie light. Her arms were raised, her hands glowing as she attempted to connect with the heart. Her face was a mask of concentration, beads of glowing sweat running down her temples. "It's testing us," she shouted back. "It wants to know if we're threats, or if we can be trusted." Jake took an uneasy step closer, feeling the weight of the swamp pressing down on him. "And how's that going so far?" Leora's glowing eyes snapped open, filled with frustration. "Not great. Your people's actions have already made it suspicious. It doesn't trust you." The ground beneath Jake's feet rumbled, and a pulse of energy shot out from the pool, forcing him to stagger back. The swamp's anger was growing, the tendrils of light lashing out violently now, striking the ground and leaving scorch marks. "This doesn't feel like a test," Jake yelled, ducking as a bolt of energy sizzled past his head. Leora turned to him, her expression a mix of determination and desperation. "It's giving us one chance, human. One chance to prove we mean no harm." Jake's fists clenched as the enormity of the moment sank in. "And how exactly do we do that?" "You have to show it," Leora said, stepping closer to the pool. "The heart reads intentions, not words. It needs to see that you're willing to give something back, to restore the balance your people disrupted." Jake hesitated, his mind racing. What could he possibly offer to an ancient, sentient swamp? Minerals? Equipment? His life? What does it want from me? he asked, his voice trembling. Lyra's glow dimmed slightly as she looked at him. Sacrifice. The heart needs to see that you're willing to risk something valuable, something that matters to you. Jake swallowed hard, his throat dry. Like what? My life. Leora didn't answer, but her silence was enough. Jake's pulse pounded in his ears. He glanced at the pool, its surface rippling like a living thing. And then at Leora. Her glowing skin flickered weakly, a reminder of how much energy she had already spent trying to calm the swamp. He thought about Earth, about the people relying on him to complete his mission. They had no idea what they'd disturbed, no idea what was at stake. If he walked away now, the swamp would consume everything. Leora, the colony, maybe even the entire planet. Jake took a shaky breath, stepping forward. All right, he said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. What do I have to do? Lyra's eyes widened slightly, surprised by his resolve. Place your hand in the pool, she said softly. It will take what it needs. Jake stared at the glowing liquid, his stomach twisting. Take what? Energy, Leora replied. Maybe more. I don't know. Jake shot her a look. That's not very reassuring. It's the truth, Leora said, her voice firm. The swamp demands balance. If you want to save your people, you have to prove you're willing to pay the price. Jake's hands trembled as he reached out. The energy radiating from the pool was almost unbearable, a searing heat that seemed to reach into his soul. He glanced back at Leora one last time. Tell my people, he said, his voice low. Tell them what happened here. Make sure they understand. Leora nodded, her expression solemn. I will. With that, Jake plunged his hand into the pool. Pain. Searing, blinding pain shot through him, ripping a scream from his throat. It wasn't just physical. It was deeper, like the heart was pulling at his very essence. Images flashed before his eyes. The history of the swamp, the rise and fall of civilizations, the countless lives it had absorbed. Jake gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stay still. His body trembled, his knees buckling as the heart drained his energy. He could feel it probing his mind, his memories, his intentions. Every mistake, every regret. Nothing was hidden. And then, suddenly, it stopped. Jake collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. The glow of the pool dimmed, its tendrils retreating. The swamp grew silent, the heavy hum fading into nothingness. For a moment, Jake thought it might be over. Leora rushed to his side, her glow brighter now. You did it, she whispered, helping him sit up. The heart pulsed softly, its anger replaced by a sense of calm. Jake stared at it, his body weak, but his mind clearer than ever. Let's hope it stays that way, he said, his voice hoarse. Because I'm not doing that again. A new understanding. The swamp was silent, unnervingly so. The once violent hum of the heart had faded, leaving only the gentle rustling of the wind through the towering trees. Jake sat at the edge of the glowing pool, his body weak and trembling. The light of the heart had dimmed, its once blinding brilliance now a soft, rhythmic pulse, like a steady heartbeat. You're lucky to be alive, Leora said quietly, kneeling beside him. Her silver hair shimmered faintly, the glow of her skin stronger than before. I wasn't sure the heart would let you go. Jake chuckled weakly, though there was little humor in it. Yeah, well, I wasn't sure I'd survive either. He looked at the pool, its surface now calm and still. The energy radiating from it was no longer oppressive. Instead, it felt peaceful, like the swamp had finally decided to rest. It's quiet, Jake murmured, his voice almost a whisper. Leora nodded. You gave it what it needed. Balance has been restored. For now. For now. Jake raised an eyebrow, his wariness replaced by a flicker of concern. Leora met his gaze, her expression serious. The heart remembers, human. It's calm now, but it won't forget what your people did. If they come back, if they disturb it again, there won't be a second chance. Jake's stomach sank. He had risked everything to calm the heart, but it wasn't a permanent solution. It was a warning. "What happens if they don't listen?" he asked, his voice heavy. Lyra's glowing eyes darkened slightly. "The swamp will rise again. And next time, it won't stop until everything is gone." Jake leaned back, staring at the canopy of alien trees above. The weight of his responsibility pressed down on him like never before. He thought about Earth, about the company that had sent him here. They wouldn't understand. To them, this was just another resource to exploit. But now, Jake knew better. "I'll tell them," he said firmly, sitting up straighter. "I'll make them understand. The mining has to stop." Leora tilted her head, studying him. "Do you really think they'll listen? Your people don't have a great track record when it comes to listening." Jake met her gaze, determination hardening his features. "They'll listen. I'll make sure of it. And if they don't, well, they'll have to deal with the swamp." Lyra's lips curved into a faint smile. "For a human, you're not entirely useless." Jake smirked, shaking his head. "I'll take that as a compliment." The two sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their journey settling in. Despite their differences, there was a sense of mutual respect now, a fragile alliance born from shared survival. Finally, Leora stood, her glow brightening as she looked back at the pool. "I'll guide you back to your camp. But after that, you're on your own. I need to return to my people." Jake got to his feet, wobbling slightly before steadying himself. "Your people? Will they be okay?" "They'll adapt," Leora said. "We always do. But you, human, you have a harder job ahead of you. The swamp gave you a second chance. Don't waste it." Jake nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. "I won't." As they began their journey back, the swamp felt different. The oppressive air had lifted, replaced by an almost serene stillness. The creatures in the trees chirped softly, as if sensing the change. The ground, once treacherous, seemed firmer, less hostile. When they reached the edge of the swamp, where Jake's equipment lay abandoned, he turned to Leora. "I meant what I said. I'll make them stop." Leora nodded, her expression unreadable. "I hope so. For all our sakes." She stepped back into the shadows, her glowing form fading into the mist. Jake watched her go, a strange mix of gratitude and sadness washing over him. He felt like he was leaving more than just the swamp behind. He was leaving a part of himself. As he powered up his communication device, preparing to send his report to Earth, Jake took one last look at the swamp. The heart's faint glow was visible even from here, a reminder of the balance he'd fought to restore. And as he began to speak, his voice steady and clear, Jake made a silent vow. Whatever it took, he wouldn't let the swamp's warning be ignored. The heart had given him a second chance. Now, it was up to him to make sure humanity earned it.